Hi, I'm Peter Reinhardt, and welcome to the Johnson & Wales International Symposium on Bread. I'm coming to you from the Hance Auditorium in Charlotte, North Carolina, where we've held the last 4 bread symposiums, and as you can see, there's nobody here but me. And this is where we usually have it. The seats are all empty because this year, thanks to you, the symposium will be presented online, virtually, in our new presentation hall, which is where I will join you in just a minute. Thank you, and thanks for being part of our new virtual Johnson & Wales International Symposium on Bread, presented by Puratos. Welcome again. Throughout the entire symposium, I'll be thanking our generous sponsors over and over again, and ask that you do as well by visiting their booths and pavilions in the exhibitor hall. There you will see lots of bonus content, and you can also make appointments to meet with the folks from these companies that serve our baking community so well. Our presenting sponsor is Puratos, who has partnered with us from the very beginning for all of our symposiums, and it is their support that helped us get this one-of-a-kind gathering of thought leaders off the ground. Please also visit our fabulous flour and milling sponsors, Ardent Mills, Lindley Mills, and Central Milling. Thank you also to our equipment sponsors, the WP Bakery Group and Allied Bakery and Food Service Equipment. And thank you also to our specialty food product companies, Probiotine, Fire Within, Big Green Egg, and Mock Mill. Please check out all of their booths to learn about their wonderful and unique products. And also thanks to our media sponsors, Cook's Country, The Local Palate, the James Beard Foundation, and the Bread Bakers Guild of America. You'll be hearing more about all of them throughout the entire series of presentations. So again, thank you to all our sponsors. At the end of today's presentation, you will also see our credit scroll, thanking all of the people behind the scenes who made this event possible, including our production and technical partner, Ganoid Communications, our creative team at Gumbo Marketing, and the many folks at Johnson & Wales University, our hosts for this, our 4th annual gathering. So stick around, if you will. But now, it's time to get things rolling with today's presentation, so let's go live. And once again, welcome to the Johnson & Wales International Symposium on Bread, presented by Puratos. Yes, and we are live again. Welcome, everybody, and thanks for coming back. I think this is week 6 now of the International Symposium on Bread. It's hard to believe. It feels like we were just planning it yesterday, but that was 9 months ago, and time is just going very, very fast. So in a second, I want to introduce you to Stephen Bloom, our featured speaker for today. But before I do, a few announcements. First and foremost, stick around at the end of the presentation before we break for the after party while we're still in this webinar. We are going to spin the wheel for the first time. Today is the first Wheel of Fortune, contest for our prize. And again, for those who are just joining us, this prize will be this incredible knife from Henkel's, bread knife that I call a sword. So we'll be spinning for that. Thank you all those who have signed the guest book and made yourself eligible for this. There's a lot of names, and you'll see it'll be fun, and you'll get to see it at the end. And a couple of other things just to let you know. Well, first of all, be sure to continue to go to the sponsor booths if you haven't, and sign, because if you sign the guest books, it will make you eligible. And while you're there, leave a note and tell the sponsors what your interests are, and if you have any questions about their products, that would be great. This Wednesday, come back for our Bake Like a Pro Day, and our demo this week will be Daisy Chow of Breadboard Bakery in Arlington, Massachusetts, who's going to be doing a demo on destination-worthy croissants using high extraction and local grains. So last week when we were doing chocolate babkas, we saw a lot about lamination and a unique technique for making babka using laminated dough. We're going to continue that lamination theme on Wednesday with Daisy. And again, she's got a small bakery in Arlington, but doing amazing work. And she's going to show us essentially through her commitment to working with local grains, how to make incredible croissants. Next week, Chef Frank Murphy, and this is July 5th, the day after the 4th of July. If you can, join us, please, then. And remember that if you miss any of these demos, you can get all of them on the archives, these presentations. But Frank, it has a project out in Oregon where he teaches youth who have had challenges to learning or challenges, for getting ahead in life. And he has found a way to break through with them using fire and baking. And he's got an oven called the Blazing Bulldog. And you're going to see all about it. He made a terrific short little documentary film about his work with them. And then he's going to come around and stay around to answer questions with all of you. So I won't say much more about the Blazing Bulldog, except you're going to want to see this for yourself. It's a really cool, the video itself is quite well made. And the project is really heart touching. Next Wednesday, we'll have Shai Farjian, a very talented chef who's going to show you how to make khachapuri, which is the famous Georgian flatbread. It's kind of like Georgian pizza on a grill. So khachapuri on the grill. I've seen him do it. They're beautiful. You're going to want to make it as soon as you see how he does it, because they're pretty exciting. And then after that, coming up in the weeks to come, Serge Amaya will be talking about the Mission to Mars project. That's something that is really sort of, we love kind of, again, talking about the future of bread being way out of the box. And here we're going to be finding out latest updates on this project to bake bread in outer space, even to be able to bake it on the moon and on Mars. And I don't know, tell Matt Damon he should join us that day, because really he's told that story in his film. And then Michael Calanti will be joining us after that. He'll be doing a demonstration on making prebiotic bread for gut health. So we're going to have a whole focus and a number of presentations to come that address health and wellness issues, and with our focus on kind of flipping the script on bread as being the solution rather than the target, and that so many people want to make it for issues that have to do with gut health. So lots to come. But now I want to introduce our guest for today, Stephen Bloom. Steve, why don't you join us? So you're going to say a few words about your presentation, which is, well, let me see. I'm going to say it because I've screwed up the title of this a few times. The past, no, not the past, but it's thermal oil technology.
Back to the future of
back to the future. Thank you. Back to the future. For some reason, I've had a hard time with this. Anyway. This is our time to kind of get real immersion in this whole idea of thermal oil, which again goes back to the heart and soul of original and future baking. So lots of implications. Steve, why don't you set up the talk that you've videoed for us, and then I'm going to turn it over to you. I'm going to drop out. Those of you who want to start sending questions our way, I'll collect them, and we'll come back live after the presentation, and Steve will answer those questions for you. You can do them through the Q&A or through the chat. So, Steve, it's all yours.
Thanks, Peter. No, I don't want to say much before the presentation, other than the fact that it is pre-recorded, because I didn't trust myself to be able to insert slides and videos on the fly in the correct position. I'm not sure that they all are in the correct position anyway, but it'll be better than if I had done this live. But just to confuse you or to keep you on your toes, even though this was done a few days ago, I've worn the same shirt today. So just see if you can figure out whether it's really live or Memorex. Anyway, enjoy the presentation, and I'll look forward to answering your questions afterwards. Hi, everyone. And thank you, Peter, for the introduction. Good to be with you, although I wish I could see all of you. But I'm happy to have this opportunity to speak about a subject that I really love. As you may have read in my bio, I've been in this industry now for close to 40 years. And so you can imagine I have more than a few stories I could tell. And actually, that reminds me of something that happened when my brother and I threw a surprise 90th birthday party for my father some years ago. as the family gathered down in Florida, we had a wonderful lunch together, and we went back to his little apartment to chat. And everyone started to reminisce with him about good times they had spent together, things that were memorable to them. You know, at a certain point, my father stopped and shook his head slightly and said, "There's so much to forget." I definitely have forgotten a lot, but I do remember how I first got introduced to thermal oil baking technology. I was still pretty new at this, maybe 5 or 6 years into it, and excited about going to my first EBA show, which that year was taking place in Hamburg, Germany. This was the late 1980s. A customer of mine in Southern California who did a lot of pastry and other products for food service, and especially airlines, his name was Heinrich Weber, and he was from Munich. He told me that he couldn't go that year because he had to head to Hawaii for a sales visit, but since I was going, could I please be on the lookout for something for him? He was baking at that time in a bank of something like 12 or 13 rack ovens. And the racks rolling around the bakery were driving him crazy. He said, "I need more versatility than I can get out of a tunnel oven. But I've heard that there's someone out there making a multi-deck tunnel oven, so you could bake different products simultaneously on different decks. And if that is true, that could possibly be a solution for me. So please see if you run into something like that while you're at the show." So I'm walking around the show and I stumble across what looks exactly like a multi-deck tunnel oven, or the front section of one, and I excitedly go into the booth to try and learn more about it. At first, the people I was approaching were not really interested in helping me. In fact, their attitude was, "This young American guy is not going to be a serious customer for us, and he's not going to understand this anyway." But the owner of the company, a very tall man who didn't speak English particularly fluently, but understood it and understood what he was overhearing, summoned me over, took me aside, sat me down, and proceeded to tell me what this was really all about. And I walked out of that booth half an hour later, or however long it was, because honestly, I don't know, having completely shifted my understanding of what I had found. Because I hadn't found a multi-deck tunnel oven. That was simply a side effect. That was something that was made possible by the baking technology inside the oven. I had stumbled onto a new way of baking based on the heat transfer medium of thermal oil. And that had an effect on the quality of the bake and on the kinds of ovens that could be built as a result. I walked out of there, my paradigm completely shifted, basically a convert, and I was ready to spread the gospel, so to speak. Well, I spent the next year or so trying to find the brave soul or souls in the US that would be willing to be the pioneers, willing to believe enough in the advantages of this technology to be the first and to spend the money on it. And I eventually found two that were just crazy enough or visionary enough, or I'd like to think dedicated enough to producing the highest quality bread they could produce to give it a shot. And the rest is now, as they say, history. So what was it that I learned in the course of my surprise education in that booth? Let me introduce that with another quick story from the more recent past. A few years ago, I got a call from Michel Suez, who many of you know. He said, "Chad Robertson has been asking me about thermal oil, and I know you know much more about this than I do, so can you please give him a call?" Well, I knew Tartine, having lived in San Francisco, but it had never occurred to me to even approach Chad about this technology because it is quite expensive, and he was baking, what, 200 loaves a day, maybe? But I called him, and he said, "Yes, I'm interested in knowing more about this. Can you send me some literature?" I said, "No, I'm not going to send you literature. This is too complex a discussion for that. But let me know when I can come out and see you, and I'll be there." So we set up a meeting. I flew back out to San Francisco, walked into the restaurant, and when he walked over to me, before I could even get a greeting out of my mouth or shake his hand, he said, with as great an intensity and emphasis as you can imagine, "I need more thermal mass." And I said, "You've just saved me about 2 hours of explanation of what thermal oil is about." Because thermal mass is indeed the secret to baking the kind of bread many of us crave and aim for. It is the secret behind the gentle and previously unparalleled bake of the traditional stone or brick oven. And it is the antidote to the limiting effect of what bakers know as flash heat. I'll get back to that in a moment, but to head backwards into the history of how thermal oil technology came to be applied to baking ovens, we head back to Germany and to the little town of Bell. I don't know, population maybe 3,000, something like that, near the Lachsee or Maria Lach, a lake that is actually the crater from a volcano that erupted about 13,000 years ago. The area was then covered with several types of stone from the cooling lava, including something called tuff stone, which it turned out had ideal heat retention properties for baking ovens. This was a very light and porous stone with very poor qualities of heat conductance, but very good qualities of heat retention. And the effect was that when it was fully heated up, it released that energy very slowly and consistently. So it started to be used as the basis for bread baking ovens, which were initially heated with wood fires in the oven chamber. And once the stone was fully heated, the bread would be placed on the hearth and it would bake as the stone maintained its temperature and very, very slowly by radiation, primarily, gave up its temperature over time. For several centuries at least, starting in the 1700s officially with the newly recognized profession of bread baker or bread maker, but certainly for a long time before that as well, the town of Bell became a center for oven builders. It was the only place you could harvest this special tough stone. At its height, there were over 50 different small oven builders in the town of Bell, using that local stone as the basis for baking ovens. Eventually, the construction of these ovens grew in sophistication in the 20th century to the point where the fire would be in a separate chamber, and in fact, a quite dangerous high-pressure steam tube technology heated by the fire transferred the energy to the stone in the baking chamber. And you can imagine when there were 38 or 50 oven builders, what the competition was like when someone heard of a new project, a new bakery that was going to start. Here's the thing. In most modern ovens, the heat is brought to the baking chamber by heating air in some sort of firebox or heat exchanger, whether it be by burning gas, wood, oil, or whatever, and moving that air into the baking chamber. The typical indirect fired cyclothermic oven takes that air and circulates it through radiators above and sometimes also below the baking decks. And those radiators heat both the baking hearth, which is often stone or more commonly now manufactured stone, and the air in the baking chamber. The problem is that air, while also not a good conductor of heat, has a very low capacity to store heat energy. So in order to achieve, for example, a 500-degree baking chamber, to compensate for the energy loss from what the product you're trying to bake is going to absorb, you need to heat that air way above 500 degrees in order for the energy to be replenished fast enough to maintain that 500-degree temperature in the baking chamber. In fact, you need to heat the air to somewhere in the range of 610 to 625 degrees. This temperature differential between the 500 degrees you want and the temperature of the heat transfer medium is known as the delta T. Delta, of course, being the mathematical sign for differential. And this is an important key to the quality of the bake in the oven, because where there's no bread to absorb that extra temperature, the temperature does in fact radiate back and build up to that higher temperature. So that means that in the empty spaces around the bread, the temperature is much higher than you really want. This is what's called flash heat. In traditional tunnel ovens, for example, many of you will know that it was and still is the standard practice to start the production with a few rows of pans filled with water to absorb that extra flash heat, or else the first rows of bread products put into the oven will burn. But the thing is, even once that initial blast of heat is dissipated, there's still to some degree the effect of flash heat in the empty space surrounding every individual product. And that's a flash heat that no one talks about. But that extra heat dries out the product, reduces the effect of the steam, sets the crust too quickly, and limits the oven spring. And the moisture retention is also compromised as a result. So the thermal oil, a synthetic oil specifically designed for heat transfer systems, has 2,700 times the thermal mass or heat storage capacity of air. As a result, the delta T required to maintain the desired baking chamber temperature is much, much lower, as low as about 27 degrees Fahrenheit, depending on the manufacturer. And having such a low temperature differential between the heat radiation source and the desired baking chamber temperature, the flash heat is dramatically lower. The oven spring is spectacular. The crust can come out crisp without being thick and leathery. And the moisture retention and distribution in the product can be so much improved as to noticeably extend the shelf life of the bread. And not only bread, by the way. During the question and answers, if you stick around and if someone reminds me, I'll relate a story about how a cake baker justified the purchase of a new tunnel oven based on this improved distribution of moisture in his product. In fact, the generation that was used to the bread coming out of these old stuff, stone, tough stone ovens, those who are still alive reminisce nostalgically that the bread they used to get would stay fresh and moist for up to a week, whereas now the bread they buy dries out after a day or two. Thermal oil as a technology for baking ovens is meant to reproduce that traditional, non-aggressive, superior bake using a modern, reliable, consistent, highly energy efficient technology. It produces a quality of bread that literally cannot be duplicated, at least not on any kind of commercial scale, except with a thermal oil oven. I can tell you a couple of stories to illustrate this. The first was when we installed the first thermal oil rack ovens at La Brea Bakery's first production facility on Washington Street in Los Angeles. More on the design of these ovens later, but these are ovens where a rack of products is inserted into an oven with fixed cantilevered thermal oil radiators that fit in between each shelf of product on the rack that is rolled into the oven. So the oven bakes with radiation like a deck oven rather than with convection like a rotating rack oven. The second day we were testing these ovens, Nancy Silverton came by and tasted a baguette and admired the beautifully evenly colored rows of baguettes on the cooling rack and agreed these were at least of the quality of her normal baguettes. What she didn't realize was that what she was tasting and was looking at were leftover baguettes from the bake the day before. 24 hours on, they had enough of the qualities of the baguette she was used to when they first came out of her normal oven that they fooled her into thinking they were from that day's production. One more story. Chad Robertson ended up purchasing a thermal oil oven for his new manufactory without ever actually test baking in one, just based on what he had seen visiting thermal oil ovens in Germany with me and on his intuitive understanding of the benefits of the technology. But before he actually ever did get delivery on his own oven, so he had never really baked in one, he and I were back in Europe together testing out vacuum cooling technology. And our supplier had delivered a small test model thermal oil oven to the vacuum cooling company so that Chad could get an accurate read on how the products would really come out. The first dough we put into the oven was, in typical Chad fashion, super hydrated. I don't remember the details, but I would say it was over 100% hydration dough. And when it landed on the hearth, it almost immediately settled into basically the form of a thick pancake. Yet within a minute or two, seemingly miraculously, it started to rise up into a flying saucer and then eventually into a boule-like shape. Chad turned to me and said, "Everything you ever told me about this oven was true." Again, the reason for the bake characteristics of this oven, the fact is that thermal oil holds so much energy. It has so much thermal mass, exactly what Chad had asked me for, that it's not necessary to heat the heat transfer medium, thermal oil, inside the radiator, giving heat to the baking chamber to a temperature significantly higher than the desired baking temperature. And when the product is put into the oven, the temperature does not drop and therefore does not require a new blast of heat. A thought experiment, although I warn you, it's kind of a gruesome one, can really give you a visceral feeling of what the difference is in the immediacy and power of the energy transfer from a medium that has a low thermal mass or energy storage capability versus a higher thermal mass, specifically air versus oil. Imagine you have a rack oven heated to 350 degrees Fahrenheit. Before putting your rack of products into the oven, you open the door and you could briefly stick your arm inside to feel how hot it was. You would certainly retract your arm quickly, but you wouldn't burn yourself. Now, imagine putting your arm into 350-degree oil. I don't even like to think about that, okay? I think you get the picture. So let's look at this technology a bit in terms of how it applies to baking ovens and what types of oven constructions it makes possible, what kinds of side benefits there are, and how all of this relates to the overarching themes of this conference. Here's a diagram of a typical thermal oil installation. The first thing you notice is that there are no burners in the oven. There's one burner for the whole system, even with more than one oven involved, and it burns into a heat exchanger in which there's a coil filled with thermal oil. The oil is heated and is pumped through insulated pipes to radiators in the ovens. You can see that the piping brings the oil to the ovens and then returns it to the heat exchanger in a continuous loop. So the first and important side benefit of this system, the burner is normally put in a remote location, like a machine room, for example. So the heat exchanger is away from the production floor, and therefore the burner is away from the production floor. So this way, the heat and noise from the burner is not on the production floor, and the flour dust from the production floor doesn't get into the burner. This drastically reduces the need for maintenance on burners and increases their life considerably. You might wonder how you can connect more than one oven to the same heat exchanger. And in fact, one early manufacturer of these ovens did have only a direct circuit and therefore one heat exchanger for each oven and only one temperature possible in each oven. But now most manufacturers use what is called a secondary circuit system. The principal circuit brings oil from the heat exchanger to the oven, but then secondary circuits, each with their own pumps, thermostats, and mixing valves, monitor and blend the new heated oil with recirculated oil from the baking chamber to get whatever temperature is desired below the primary circuit temperature. Each oven can be on its own circuit, but even different sections of decks within the same oven can be on separate circuits, allowing you to bake, for example, at one temperature in one group of, say, 3 decks, and different temperatures in another group of another 3 decks. So an important feature of these ovens is flexibility. Another important feature is consistency, because thermal oil is a liquid medium, and basically it covers the entire deck area. The temperature is perfectly the same everywhere across the baking surface. The oil travels in a serpentine path from the inlet of the radiator to the outlet. So there are no hot spots and no need to rotate the breads, greatly simplifying production. And in fact, the temperature of the oil entering the circuit and the temperature of the oil leaving the circuit never varies by more than 2 degrees Celsius, which is also an indication of the incredible energy efficiency of these ovens. In fact, where most conventional ovens will have an energy efficiency of something like 50 or 60%, meaning that about 50% of the energy that you put in actually goes into the product, these ovens can have an energy efficiency of somewhere around 87%. This energy savings alone justifies the expense of the oven easily in countries where energy cost is high. Though it's a great advantage, energy here in the US has so far been inexpensive enough that that alone has not been able to pay for the oven quickly enough for many customers. But that's changing. The awareness of the need to save energy is growing here as everywhere. And of course, there are other advantages that justify the ovens, the most important one of which we've already talked about, which is the unparalleled and unmatched quality of the bread. I spoke earlier about various types of ovens that one can build because of this technology. So let's go back for a moment to that, because there are indeed some types of thermal oil ovens that are pretty familiar to everyone, like deck ovens, but some others that are not, and take a little bit to wrap one's head around. I don't want to spend too much time talking about large industrial ovens, because this conference, as far as I understand it, is, in my experience, not primarily oriented towards industry. But one reason for thermal oil success is the fact that it has allowed ambitious companies to bake artisan quality bread on an industrial scale. I remember when La Brea Bakery was first transitioning to par-baked product and building their first big factory. They were looking at conventional tunnel ovens and were being told that, of course, they would have to accept a certain degree of compromise in their product when they scaled up, because by then, most of all of their product was baked in thermal oil ovens. I told them this is nonsense. And I pretty much grabbed them by the proverbial scruff of the neck and dragged them, plastic container of sourdough starter and all, over to Germany to test in a thermal oil tunnel oven. When the first breads came out, the Germans, who weren't used to the look of the bread, by the way, were laughing at the fermentation bubbles, which they took as a sign of defective bread. But George Erasmus took one look at the crust, the oven spring, and that special thermal oil glow, which we can talk about, and said to his amazement, "This is our bread." Anyway, I do want to get back to that first experience I had looking at the EBA show for a multi-deck tunnel oven, because only with thermal oil is an oven like that practical. Of course, a few companies had experimented with the concept before, notably using steam tube technology on 3 decks. But in those ovens, the bread never came out even, and the middle deck always baked differently from the other 2. And people just accepted that. But with thermal oil, you can control the temperature at any point in the oven within 2 Celsius degrees. So the bread is always going to come out the same, no matter on what deck, no matter where on the deck it sits. And in a multi-deck oven, it will sit, because the oven loader loads a deck in steps. And in a normal tunnel oven, it doesn't matter if there are variations in temperature, because each loaf of bread stays in those zones the same length of time. But if the oven belt is only moving when the deck is being loaded with another loader full, about 4 feet of product typically, and otherwise sitting static, not all breads will sit in the same temperature unless the temperature really is the same everywhere, which in a thermal oil oven it can be. So the thermal oil technology allows the production of huge multi-deck ovens, often 7 or 8 decks high. And occasionally, in some executions, even more, saving incredible amounts of floor space compared to a single level tunnel oven. And depending on the design of the secondary circuits, also potentially allowing different products to be baked at different temperatures simultaneously on different decks, which of course is what Mr. Weber was looking for. This feature of the secondary circuits, allowing a deck oven to have different zones, for example, 2 decks at one temperature, 2 at another, also applies on the more artisan level of our industry. For example, in automatically front-loaded or even manually front-loaded thermal oil static deck ovens that can be up to 12 decks high. And there are often 4 groups of 3 decks in those ovens, each with separately controlled temperature. Another unusual feature for deck ovens is the ability to have pull-out decks, as the bottom decks of the oven on this slide. Because the thermal oil radiator that stays in the oven does not lose temperature in any significant way, and the stone doesn't give up its temperature quickly, one can pull the deck out of the oven, for example, for hand placement of trays or other products that do not adapt well to the traditional loading methods like setters or peels of deck ovens. Another oven type that's really interesting and incredibly useful for certain types of products is the thermal oil rack/deck hybrid oven, which I know is a poor description, but I can't think of a good one, that several manufacturers refer to as a thermo roll or a similar designation. We mentioned this before. From the outside, it looks like a normal rack oven, but open the door and it's completely different because you can't enter the oven. Instead, as you saw, there are thermal oil radiators cantilevered out from the back of the oven, taking up the space in the oven and spaced according to how many decks or shelves you want the oven to have, which is dependent on the maximum height of the product that you intend to bake in the oven. Special racks are designed to slide in between those radiators so that each shelf of the rack, which holds, for example, trays of pastries or fluted pans of baguettes or strapped bread tins, bakes between a radiator below it and a radiator above it. So in reality, you handle the product on racks, similar to the type of rack oven we're used to, but the bake is the bake of a deck oven, with radiant heat above and below the product rather than a convection bake. The results are gorgeous. Another thing about these ovens is the strength of the steam. Because the steam generators are powered by thermal oil in tubes running through the steel steam generators, the quantity and duration of the steam is unmatched compared to any other type of oven. And as I said, because of the lack of flash heat, the steam stays at a lower temperature and does not dry out as fast. And the wetter the steam, the better the effect on the bread. Other than the dots on the bottom of the product, if you're baking on a screen, you really can't tell the difference. If you cut the products in cross-section and look at the structure, you won't see anything different from the same product baked in a true deck oven. And of course, you can heat multiple ovens like this with one remote heat exchanger, each baking independently because each will be on its own secondary circuit. That minimizes the holes in the roof of your building because the only flue is the one from the heat exchanger itself. And as you add more ovens, unless you add another heat exchanger, you don't have to add any more holes for flues, just for steam exhaust. One manufacturer has even started making an actual rotating convection rack oven using a thermal oil system to heat the air. But because of the thermal mass of that air heat exchanger within the oven, the air can be reheated more quickly than in a conventional rack oven. So the temperature does not drop significantly when you open the oven door and put in a rack of cold product. This not only shortens the bake time, but improves the quality of the bake noticeably because the product is baking at the temperature you want it to right from the outset. I just want to finish by touching on something I briefly mentioned, which is the energy efficiency of these ovens. Their design actually helps create energy efficiency in more than one way. Because of the design principle of these ovens, it's possible to pull a lot of energy from the single flue exiting the heat exchanger and capture that energy and store it in the form of hot water for the bakery to use for any number of purposes. With one energy recovery unit on the flue, and if desired, one on each of the steam exhausts from each oven, a lot of energy can be recovered and reused, as much as maybe 40%, including the energy retained in the thermal oil itself. In addition, because the heat exchanger can be powered with a gas burner, oil burner, or any other type of heat source, it can also be built to be powered by electricity. I don't know how many of you know about Bread Alone's revamp of their original bakery in Boyceville, New York, in the Catskills, scheduled to open later this year. But they're putting in thermal oil ovens, the heat exchanger for which will be powered by solar panels on their roof. And that will even power a new powerful steam generator, again, thermal oil based steam generator that will supply steam to their old brick ovens, which they'll be keeping as well. There's so much detail that I've left out, of course, in the service of keeping this talk a manageable length. I hope you'll stick around to ask some questions or even hang out in the so-called VIP lounge. But just to sum up a couple of themes and tie up some loose ends, I'd like to say, I hope I've given you the idea that this technology can indeed satisfy a lot of the aims that we all, as people interested in furthering the art and science, of course, of so-called artisan bread, have for the future. One really significant feature that I've already mentioned that I believe is worth emphasizing is that this technology, by increasing moisture retention and distribution in the product, can increase shelf life without additives, allowing for greater distribution of quality breads and creating a better customer experience. This also has had a significant historical effect, in my opinion. We know that freezing tends to dry out products. So extra moisture retention is super critical for the success of par-baked frozen distribution. And par-baked frozen distribution of artisan bread, in my opinion, was the catalyst that has changed over the past 30 years the way Americans view what bread can and should be. In fact, the proliferation of small artisan-oriented bakeries throughout the country now, and the availability of artisan-style breads in supermarkets all over the country is something that did not exist 30 years ago. And this derives, in my opinion, from the possibilities opened up by thermal oil baking. I would say that two of the most influential and successful purveyors of quality artisan-style bread on an industrial scale, La Brea and Tribeca Oven, were only able to accomplish what they did through the use of thermal oil technology. That's not to say that this was the only factor, of course, but it was a critical one. Which leads me to one last story. I remember in the fairly early days of La Brea Bakery's frozen par-baked distribution that the San Francisco Chronicle decided to have a contest for the best baguette in San Francisco. So they went and bought baguettes from various sources, including all the, at the time, famous artisan bakeries in San Francisco and other retail outlets. This was, of course, done as a blind tasting. When they tabulated the results, they were both shocked and dismayed. So to be sure it was really, kosher, they redid the entire test and the results were the same. The best sourdough baguette in San Francisco was from La Brea Bakery of Los Angeles. Horrors. A par-baked frozen baguette that had been finished in the ovens at Whole Foods. Beyond this characteristic of increased moisture retention, which derives from the low delta T of the thermal oil oven, there are other important advantages this technology brings to the baker, among them significant energy-related benefits. Thermal oil ovens can help create a greener footprint for the bakery by increasing energy efficiency and reducing energy usage, by facilitating energy recovery, and even by allowing for alternative sources of energy to power the baking itself. Also, they can increase the consistency of the product you put out and reduce waste without requiring the constant attention of skilled bakers to monitor the bake. And if you stick around for questions, I'll tell you a story about how that argument applied on what was almost my very first sale of one of these ovens. Over the years, I've been working with this technology and with several different manufacturers of these ovens. I've really learned to appreciate its unique advantages, as well as the differences between how different manufacturers apply the technology. Mind you, not everything can be baked in a thermal oil oven. Mostly the reason being that there's a temperature limit of the oil, which translates to a maximum bake temperature of about 570 degrees Fahrenheit. So no Neapolitan pizza, no pita bread. But for the vast majority of products most of us bake, it produces products that have no equal, and that give the users of these ovens the possibility of producing a product that no one that doesn't have one of these ovens can match, which can be an amazing competitive advantage in a market where the consumer's expectation and recognition of quality is growing more sophisticated every year. Thank you all for your attention. I hope you found this informative and at least slightly entertaining, and I really look forward to your questions.
Well, that was really interesting, I found. Thank you so much, Stephen. That was, for the first time, I feel like I finally was able to get my mind around the whole concept, and it was great having those illustrations as well. I just want to point out that I was living in San Francisco when the San Francisco Chronicle ran that taste test with all the baguettes, and it was truly it was front page news in San Francisco that the winning baguette was not from San Francisco, but from LA. It was like, what, and
it was a shock.
It was, and I think that it was also probably the launch of the par bake revolution, really, because that was when, in a sense, proof of concept that that it really worked. It feels like just yesterday. I think, when was it? It was sometime in the 1990s, I believe.
Early 90s, yeah, early 90s.
And I was still living there. I was teaching at the California Culinary Academy at the time, and it was water cooler conversation for sure. And there was a couple of other things. The question.
Well, thank you for mentioning that I didn't make that story up.
Yeah, right. I vouch for that story. Steve, before we take questions, let me just throw it back to you. Are there any other things based on what you just saw in your presentation that you wanted to either gloss on or embellish?
Yeah, actually there is, because I realized that I left out an important logical link. I went back to the town of Bell and that extinct volcano, and the Tough Stone, to explain how Bell became the center of oven building in Germany. What I didn't mention explicitly was that the two companies that ended up really developing the technology of thermal oil as applied to baking ovens were in the town of Bell. And that's how it got started. And that's the reason it got started. And one of those, the one that I currently represent, Hoeft, makes close to 50% of the total thermal oil baking surface in the world every year. And they are one of two oven builders left in the town of Bell. Them and a small guy who's still making little stone ovens.
Oh, wow. Interesting. But the idea of thermal oil technology, thermal oil heating, didn't come from Bell. Where did that originate?
Well, no, thermal oil heating technology existed in other industries. What came from the town of Bell was the idea of applying it to baking in order to duplicate or replicate what they knew as the traditional value of those stone ovens, which was their incredible capacity to hold energy.
Cold heat. Yeah, yeah. Wow. Well, the questions are starting to come in, fast and furious. Let me just quickly go through my notes. When did when do you think this technology actually did originate? When was it originally?
In the 1960s.
So it is still relatively recent. Then this is not
Yeah.
something that happened like in the 1920s or turn of the century.
No.
It's a modern
Applying
technology.
the first thermal oil ovens were in probably the mid 1960s actually, and I'll well, maybe I'll tell this story later, but the supplier that I originally learned about this from um, had told me that his first year with these thermal oil ovens, they were smaller ovens. They were, small deck ovens or whatever. They weren't big industrial ovens like some of the ones you saw. But he said he had 25 or 26 ovens out there. He said, and I had 26 nightmares because he said the thermal oil, how to apply the thermal oil technology to baking ovens isn't in the books. You have to learn it by experience. And his initial experience was making all the mistakes.
Yeah.
But eventually they got it.
Well, that's how it always starts. Well, I have a whole bunch of questions of my own, but I want to open this up to the floor because the questions are coming in. And the first one, when they came right at the beginning, is, of course, I'm sure a lot of you are thinking the same thing. Is there any thermal oil solution for home bakers?
No.
It doesn't exist
Not
on that
not that I'm aware of. I mean,
not yet.
It's right. It's a very expensive technology, and there are compact versions where the heat exchanger is powered by electricity and is built in. But the smallest one that I know of that's ever been built, I mean, maybe when this was being worked on in a lab somewhere, this is not the case. But the smallest ones I know about right now are still like 4 or 5 decks high. That thermal roll style oven with the radiators cantilevered out into the space, and a little rack that rolls in.
Yeah.
There's one that they take to shows to bake in, for example, but that's that doesn't fit in the kitchen.
So an opportunity waiting to happen if somebody could figure it out.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, a couple more. I'm gonna go through these so we can get them all in. Okay, Joe says, great idea, and I love the STEM focused technology. Is there any federal money of any sort to encourage more of these systems to be built?
There is, I know there's state, and I'm sure there is federal money that people have used after demonstrating the amount of energy savings that they were going to get compared to their existing ovens. I don't know that there's any that's earmarked specifically for thermal oil ovens, but when you show the difference that you can typically, if we're talking, say, a conventional tunnel oven versus a thermal oil tunnel oven, you can show that you're likely to save about 40% of your energy cost. And people have definitely gotten money as a result of that.
Well, you think if home cooks get a tax rebate for putting in energy efficient, ovens and refrigerators and dryers and things like that,
Yeah.
that bakeries would certainly there ought to be some kind of reward for anyone who can demonstrate energy saving.
There is, for sure. There is.
Okay, great. Here's another one from Kathy. You said that the thermal oil can be used to heat Nancy's older brick ovens. Could they heat those at a higher temperature than 570 Fahrenheit?
First of all, what I said was that there's going to be, and this is bread alone, we're not talking about La Brea, but they have a couple of old brick ovens. Their brick ovens are still going to be heated the way they've always been heated, but the steam generators, the steam for those ovens was really weak. And what we're doing is we're taking the heat exchanger, from the new ovens that are going in, the new thermal oil ovens that are going in, and we're building an extra steam generator that will be powered by that thermal oil from that heat exchanger, and using that to generate steam for those old brick ovens. And as far as temperature, no, the problem is that the thermal oil itself, all oil has a temperature at which it starts to crack and break down. And that temperature for thermal oil, again, depending on which thermal oil you're using, is somewhere in the range of 600, 625 degrees. And by the time you take into consideration the small delta T that there is, and transferring that over to the ovens from the primary circuit, if you try to get a temperature above 570, you're really going to destroy your thermal oil too quickly. When you keep it at the right temperature, it lasts for years.
What kind of oil
it starts to crack.
What
What's used now is mostly completely synthetic oil, and it's made for heat transfer systems. But the 500, don't remember, when you think you need more than 570 degrees, that's because in a typical cyclothermic oven, to get your 570 degrees, you have to have 600 or more. In 570 degrees in a thermal oil oven is a real powerful 570 degrees. I don't know of bread that needs to be baked higher.
Well, even pizza,
except for things like, as I said, pita bread and Neapolitan pizza, which you want 1,000 degrees for. But
but even Neapolitan pizza, at least Neapolitan, I'll say Neapolitan-ish pizza at 570, which is much more like what Nancy is doing at her pizzeria Mozza, or what a lot of that, or Chris Bianco, even they're baking their pizzas not at 60 seconds but at 4 minutes. It seems like that would be the ideal temperature for that style pizza. And certainly for New York style. There's lots of possibilities here, and there's a lot of things I'd like to carry over into our conversation in the after party, which many of you will hopefully join us at. One final question here: what does an entry-level thermal oil oven typically cost? What's that price rate? That's from Mike.
That's a really difficult question to answer because there are so many parameters and there's so many different types of ovens, but I would say that it's difficult to get into one of these systems for less than it also depends on the exchange rate because they come from Germany, but it's difficult to get into one of these for less than a couple $100,000.
Yeah, so it really is for operations that are working at scale.
Yeah. Now, I mean, you have to understand that people compare that to one of the typical steam tube oven, and the steam tube oven basically falls apart after 7 or 8 years,
right.
And it disintegrates in terms of its baking quality. These things last 20, 30 years or more. I mean, so if you think about, again, the combination of how long they last and the energy savings that you're getting out of them and the competitive advantage, you can justify the extra money, but you have to find some way to have it to begin with. Because again, the initial cost of something is only a part of the story. The overall cost of use over the years is the more important one.
Of course. And I keep saying last question, but I don't want, for people who can't join us in the after party, I don't want them to miss out on some of these. Sarah wants to know, have any culinary education programs incorporated thermal oil systems in their baking programs? Are you aware?
Not that I'm, in this country, not that I'm aware of. In Europe, yes.
It's probably a tough sell only because the schools are working on such small units, small ovens and stuff. But it's certainly, I know that it's something that conceptually needs to be presented.
Conceptually, yeah, I agree.
Yeah, and maybe videos will make that possible, and field trips and things like that. We're going to continue this conversation. There's a lot more things I wanted you to go more into the delta T and all sorts of other things that you dropped into the conversation. want you to talk a little bit about vacuum cooling, which you mentioned having seen over there. That's a new technology when we get into the after party. But before we go, as promised, our team at Ganoid Communications, Gurmit, has our spinning wheel ready. He's going to share his screen with us for a second. Before he does, Stephen, thank you so much for this great presentation. I'm looking forward to continuing the conversation over the next hour in our after party. But thanks for bringing this to us and explaining it so well.
Gurmit, it was my pleasure. It was a lot of fun.
Thank you. And Gurmit, why don't you go ahead and put the wheel up? And we got everybody who's qualified by signing the books. Your name is going to be on this wheel, and you will see it. And we're going to give it a big spin. And once we have a winner, I will track that person down and find out where you want me to send your prize. So I think he's going to share his screen now. There's our wheel. It looks like that scary wheel that tells you your computer is kind of like, trying to catch up, but I see a lot of names on there. So Gurmit, why don't you go ahead and give it a spin, and we'll see who is our first winner. Here it goes. Spinning slowly.
Very slowly.
The wheel spins slowly. It's going to stop. When it stops, we'll know it because it will announce the winner. Kathy Lair, you are the winner. And believe me, I have nothing to do with any of this. I know a lot of you on this wheel already, but I had no say in this. This was all random, done by some kind of algorithm that the company that created this wheel gave us. Kathy, shoot me an email after we close out later today, and give me the address where you'd like me to send your knife. And thank all of you for being eligible. We're going to continue to add names as more of you sign the book. And for the next wheel, we'll probably spin it in towards the end of July. And we're going to need to have you need to have signed at least 5 books. So for five booths. So even if those of you who are already on the wheel, if you're only at 3, go back and visit the booths, sign the guest books, and get it up to 5, so that we, essentially, it's not just to, get you to go to the booths, but I want you to see the information. At every booth, there are videos, there are great information pieces, PDFs, and so explore those booths and take advantage of the knowledge that each of them have brought. Each of our sponsors has brought to you. So with that said, I'm going to go ahead and log out of here. Those of you who are coming to the after party, you know how to navigate over. Leave the presentation hall, go to the VIP lounge. Stephen and I are going to log out and log back in so that we can be in the, what do they call it, the Zoom meetings as opposed to Zoom webinar format. And that way everybody can be on the stage. And we will see you all soon. And for those who aren't joining us there, we'll see you on Wednesday for Daisy Chow Destination Croissants. And see you in just a couple minutes. We'll take about a 3 to 5 minute break, and we'll reconvene in the VIP lounge. Thank you. Thank you to our team behind the scenes. Our event technical and production partners, Ganoid Communications, including our producer, Gurmit Singh, and his team, Jita Gajaria, Gagandeep Singh, and Jaydev Kashari. Thanks also to Ted Nelson and Lael Fretzel of our creative and marketing team at Gumbo Marketing, and the many folks at Johnson & Wales University who supported me throughout this event. My executive assistant, Sarah Standifer, Communications Director, Melinda Law, Chancellor, Mim Rooney, Charlotte Campus President, Cheryl Richards, and our executive team leaders, deans and faculty, Maureen Dumas, Michael Schrader, Michelle Nicholas, Mark Norman, Brent Steyerwalt, Laurie Heinbach, Jerry Lanuza, Amy Felder, Harry Paymiller, Richard Miskovich, and many, many others. Thank you all.